Today's talk is titled, Carrying My Mother, Intergenerational Trauma to Liberation, to be delivered by Evelyn Kahan. Evelyn Kahan has been my friend for decades, and I'm so thrilled that she's here to share her personal story with you today. She was born in Lyon, France. Her family immigrated to the United States in 1949. Pacific Grove is now her home. Loving travel, she has been to 6 continents, including the microcontinent of Zealandia. She speaks 3 languages, and Evelyn is a published poet and writer of 2 English as a second language textbooks, many poems and short stories, and she is an explorer of many subjects and thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you my dear friend, Evelyn Kahan.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for welcoming me. It's always such a warm experience to be here. Yes, I entitled this talk, Carrying My Mother, Intergenerational Trauma to Liberation. And I want to show you, next slide, please. This is my family, wanted to introduce you. And you see my mother and father on the day of their marriage. That is July 27th, 1942, in Lyon, France, middle of the war. There were those who believed the war would never spread as far as it did. My parents, who were in their 20s, thought that. There were rumors of death camps, but who would believe it? Sorry. It was now 1943. My father was away on a short business trip. Mom went to spend a few days with her aunt in another town. There, a neighbor alerted the Gestapo that 2 Jews lived in her building. The Gestapo went and ordered Mom and Aunt Rochelle to pack whatever valuables they had and go with them. They were shoved into an overcrowded train car and were transported to a concentration camp known as Auschwitz. That same year, the US State Department decided to block reports about the mass murder of Jews from reaching the US. They wanted to avoid an increase in public pressure to aid Jews. Next slide. Next slide, please. My mom at 77, the age that I am now. This was the year that she wrote her autobiography. I wanted to honor her today by reading to you an excerpt from that. She starts with a dedication and a plea. To my dear daughter, Evelyn, with all my love, Mom, Frida. She had to tell me who my mom is. P.S. Don't let anybody forget. She begins, my first few months in Auschwitz. This is the second day, tattooed, stripped of my dignity, my courage, all my clothes, and whatever jewelry I had. I was outfitted in a huge striped dress with one shoe black, the other brown, and a scarf on my head. Well, Frida, I thought, better face the facts and take control of the situation. We were 8 to a bunk. Each day we were awakened very early by a stubova, the person in charge of us. She banged a stick on each bunk. Stavach, Stavach, get up, she yelled, and hit those who didn't hurry enough. We drank some brownish water and went to wash if there was room, then quickly went to roll call. On our way to our jobs, we passed by many barracks. Mounds of dead people lay in front. It was unbelievable to see some people disrobing the corpses, taking off the shoes, socks, the barrettes from dead women's hair, whatever they could find. This vision never left me. My first day of work, my job consisted of transporting by hand huge, heavy rocks from one place to another. After a few days of this, we had to do the same, taking those rocks back to where we first got them. Several weeks went by with that same routine. I was very disturbed by our Stubova's attitude. She hit people and had no regard for anybody. I took my courage and asked her why she, also a Jew, was doing this. After a few seconds of silence, she said, "You have it good now, so good. I came here from Poland in 42. There was no gas chamber then. I had to bash my mother and sister against a wall and bury them in a trench as an SS officer stood over me. I was horrified. No words came out of my mouth." The autobiography goes on. The treatment gets worse. You wouldn't know from day to day if you'd be alive to see the next one. During and after the war, many countries wouldn't allow the shiploads of Jewish refugees to dock. The US denied visas to immigrants who were, quote, likely to become a public charge, unquote. Many Jewish refugees had lost everything. Does this sound familiar? I think of hundreds of thousands of refugees roaming the world today, trying to find safe haven and opportunity. When World War II ended, my father found my mother through the Red Cross. A year later, I was born. I was a miracle, not just the sheer wonder of a newborn baby, but Mom wasn't sure what she'd been fed in camp and was worried I might not be healthy. I was once asked at a job interview who my heroes are. Without hesitation, I said, my mother and Nelson Mandela. Why them? Because my mom survived a year and a half in concentration camp, and Nelson Mandela, 27 years in prison for protesting the policies of an oppressive government. Both had lived through the systematic oppression of their people, disregard for their lives, and in my mother's case, a carefully devised plan for genocide. Yet both emerged unembittered, strong, clear-headed. They were staunch humanitarians, believed in equality. My life journey is deeply intertwined with my mother's. I entitled this presentation, Carrying My Mother. She never asked to be carried. Mostly I gleaned from my father that something terrible had happened to her and that we should treat her with deference. My father had hardships during World War II, and he suffered from survivor's guilt. He wasn't able to save his wife from the horrors. Why did I feel so many years that I was carrying my mother? I was aware of the onus of being their hope and her happiness. I know my mom had bad dreams, but it was never her idea to talk about camp. She kept it all inside. I recognize that Mom never wanted to burden us. She only talked about her experience with me once I reached adulthood. Growing up, it felt to me that my father talked about the war every night at dinner. He had the need to warn us from the time we were quite young. He usually ended it with, "And don't ever forget." Once, Mom begged him not to talk about the war. For me, a cloud loomed over the dinner table. My sister and I, from a very young age, were made cognizant of how inhumane humans could be to each other. I felt I was different from the other kids at elementary school. My classmates were all born in the US to American parents. The majority were Jewish. My sister and I were not raised to be religious, though Mom did want us to know about Judaism. Dad wasn't much for it, but Mom prevailed and Dad drove us to Sunday school. One day, I asked the class if they really believed that Moses parted the Red Sea. The teacher walked back in the room as I was asking. She didn't like that. I never went back. Through middle school and high school, I was struggling with what God was exactly, and where was God when my mother and so many others were suffering. I was consciously piecing together my view of the world. Around that time, my father added to his warnings that I shouldn't trust anybody who isn't Jewish. I don't know how that makes you feel if you're not Jewish. It made me very angry. Why was my father guiding me to feel so uneasy in the world? I became more alert around people I didn't know. At 17, I left my family home to go to college. I was no longer in a Jewish enclave. I was out in the big world now, among people from all kinds of backgrounds. It was exciting, yet a small piece of me was listening for anti-Semitic comments. Guardedly, I might let someone know I am Jewish. If I spoke about my parents' experience, I felt my peers didn't get the gravity. They weren't properly horrified. I interpreted this as apathy. A wariness lived in me. I needed help, and I tried therapy in my late 20s, even group therapy specifically for second-generation Holocaust survivors. I read the book Children of the Holocaust. It seemed that the young people the author interviewed didn't suffer, or Epstein chose not to write about that aspect of their lives. I read Why Bad Things Happen to Good People. It didn't convince me. I couldn't access my own feelings. I couldn't express the dis-ease and anger I felt in this world. It was much easier for me to understand other people's emotions. I began to recognize another behavior that manifested at inopportune times. For example, I was at a fabulous Ella Fitzgerald concert, at the Hollywood Bowl, I suddenly felt morose, ashamed. How dare I get swept up in this joy when my mother had suffered so much? Several years after the concert, pardon me, I was at a conference in Washington, D.C. It was for the Jewish constituents of NCBI, an international organization tasked with dismantling prejudice. The director asked us if we noticed in ourselves any puzzling behaviors. An American woman in her 30s raised her hand. She explained that she got very angry with her son, who never knew where his shoes were. And Sherry, the director of NCBI, gently asked her, "Why angry?" "I don't know. I know he's just a kid." "Why so angry then?" "What would happen if he couldn't find his shoes?" The questions came quickly until the woman blurted out, "What if they come after us and he can't find his shoes and we have to run?" There it was. Proof plain and clear. I'm not the only child of survivors that's been traumatized. I was beginning to understand my baggage. It hurts to think of traumas traveling from one generation to the next. There's a field of study named epigenetics or intergenerational trauma. The researchers study how our behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way our genes work. Rachel Yehuda is a scientist at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. She's been studying the field for over 12 years. In a paper she wrote, and I quote, pardon me, "The results suggest that Holocaust exposure had an effect on a mechanism that controls the gene expression. That was observed in parents as well as their offspring, many of whom showed signs of depression and anxiety. We respond," pardon me, I need a sip of water here. We respond to our environments in multiple ways that can have long-lasting, transformative effects. What happens to our parents, or perhaps even our grandparents, or previous generations, may help shape who we are on a fundamental molecular level that contributes to our behaviors, beliefs, strengths, and vulnerabilities. The children may inherit traits that promote resilience as well as vulnerability. Unlike genetic changes, epigenetic changes are reversible. And this study was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. So I'm hopeful for future generations that with manipulating the genes, people can be eased. All the difficult feelings get re-stimulated when I see oppression and injustice. The knee on George Floyd's neck, the killing of Matthew Shepard. I've never felt completely safe to divulge that I'm Jewish. Your church announcement on social media gave me pause. I was a little worried. What if some proud boy sees the announcement and ambushes me? It sounds extreme, I know, but there have been killings in places of worship in recent years. I live in Pacific Grove, and just 45 minutes away in Santa Cruz, the Jewish cemetery has been desecrated twice in the last 30 years. Where would I find that bridge to peace so I can be more effective in my life? In a bookstore, I glanced at community announcements, and there was one for a diversity workshop. I was teaching ESL, English as a Second Language, at the time. Maybe I'd learned something that would be helpful in my teaching. I hadn't imagined all that I would get from it. The workshop was given by NCBI, a nonprofit dedicated to dismantling prejudice. We started with an activity in that workshop. We stood up for our identities, birth order, religion in which you were raised, etc., even sexual orientation. We were urged to look around and notice who stood up, and we applauded them. It was suggested we notice also who wasn't there. There were no Asians and perhaps no Latinos. I felt a pang. They were missing. I was missing their presence. In small homogeneous groups, we made lists of what we hate about our group, what we love about our group, and what we want other people to know about us. We reported back to the whole assembly. That vulnerability, I think, nudged us to feel warm toward each other. I also began to explore my prejudices. Why was I surprised that a person with brown skin was head of a company? Why had I thought she or he didn't have what it takes? Next slide, please. In what is called speak outs at the workshop, we tell our stories. We practice listening without interjecting. With this respect, we give and receive. I feel heard, and I feel the sanctity of each individual's experience. My understanding of equity and justice began to expand. So I think this is a good illustration of the difference between equity and equality. And we've spoken so many years about equality, but equity is even more powerful and more effective. So if we look here, pardon me. True justice is achieved through equity, not equality. Equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. But equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. I've been active with the Monterey chapter since 1995. I joined the leadership team for many workshops we facilitated in schools, fire departments, corporations, etc. It's through being proactive, working at dismantling prejudice, that I found the bridge I needed to feel less broken and more whole. I'm excited by new skills I'm learning now, how to be an ally. If you become one, you learn to love making mistakes. But, people are really forgiving when they see you trying and caring. We all have the capacity to be an ally. Opportunities present themselves in many places. Here's an example of being an ally. There's a small Chinese community in Pacific Grove. Some of its members were offended by the way the Chinese were depicted every year in the annual festival play. One Chinese woman, Jerry Lo Sabido, tried to bring the issue up with the festival committee. She wasn't making headway. My friend Sue offered to accompany her to the next meeting. Now, Sue is white. Those of us who are white have power, privilege, simply because of our skin tone. Jerry and Sue went to the meeting together. She didn't speak for Jerry. She was simply with her. The all-white committee and Jerry at last worked through the issues together. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Okay. I love this quote. If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound to mine, then let us work together. So there are many simple ways to become an ally. Excuse me. Okay, first is recognizing and understanding our privilege, those of us who are white. We need to educate ourselves by reading books or attending trainings, whatever. There's so much available these days by Zoom. And educating ourselves about marginalized groups. Engage in critical self-reflection about our own biases. Okay, we need to do our own healing about ways that we are oppressed. And we can always help to educate others and share insights and invite others to participate in trainings or webinars that we have found that were interesting, helpful. Okay. And we can organize if we feel like doing that. I want to end my presentation with a quote from Nelson Mandela. The truth is that we are not free yet. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free, the right not to be oppressed. We have not taken the final step of our journey, but the first step on a longer and even more difficult road. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. The true test of our devotion to freedom is just beginning. Thank you.